I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. It's hard to imagine a year where health services have been more important than in 2020. It's a massive industry and one that is critical to society, never more so than during the COVID-19 pandemic. Today we're speaking to a person who's been on the front line during the pandemic and written a book to help other health professionals who are starting their career. Dr Glen Farrow is a dual qualified adult and paediatric general surgeon and a specialist service medical officer in the Australian Army. Glen has published a book, Frontline Patient Safety, 20 Strategies to Keep You and Your Patients Safe. Dr Glen Farrow, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
Quite the CV, Glen. Tell me about yourself.
I've basically had two careers, I think. I joined the Army very, very early on. It was a passion of mine, all things military, and I got into RMC Duntroon after doing HSC, but I also got into medicine. And so I ended up combining the two careers. By about the middle of university, it was clear that I could join the Army as a doctor and also continue my career in medicine in Melbourne and now in Sydney. So up until 2005, I really had those dual careers, and then I moved into, I think, full-time executive jobs from 2005. And now I've reached a stage where I've kind of finished the operational jobs you get in hospitals running medical services and quality and safety, and I'm looking to, I guess, be a bit more strategic, which is one reason why I wrote the book, to try and, I guess, document a lot of the lessons I've learned over that 30 years and try and pass them on to the next generation of healthcare professionals.
Okay, so let's just take both those parts of your early career at least. So the medicine, did you always want to be a doctor?
I think I did. I can't actually remember why. There's no doctors in our family, and I was the first, luckily, to get into university. So it was a kind of a sideways step in a sense. I think I was just inspired, to be honest, by some of the TV shows, and I've always had a willingness to want to help people. So that was a good fit for me.
And then the Army, where's that inkling come from?
Well, I guess as a young child, you tend to look up to your father. My father had served in World War II, and though we didn't know a lot about what he'd gone through, we knew a little bit. So I kind of read things up, and I was quite a military enthusiast right through my adolescence. I've been in school cadets and the cadet band, and applying for RMC Duntroon was just a natural progression.
Were there many similarities between the two? Off the top of my head, they are quite disparate careers.
Well, that's a good point. Personally, I didn't have any kind of moral dilemma between the Army and being a doctor, because, look, the Army needs, or the people within the Army need to have just as good medical support, if not better, than we do in civilian life. And I don't really have any qualms about supporting an organisation that is designed to defend Australia and its interests, which sounds a bit corny, but that's the way I thought about it. So for me, it was an ideal way of combining a bit of an academic pursuit in medicine with just finding out a bit more about soldiering, I suppose. And look, you'd be surprised how many specialists and general service doctors are around who have had something to do with the Army during their career.
I'd imagine that both take great discipline.
Look, they do, and it's really not something you think about when you're doing it. It's really when you look back and think, how did I put up with that? How did I meet those deadlines for exams? How did I, stand on a parade ground in the sun for 2 hours? Yeah, simple things like that. It does only attract a certain kind of person, and within medicine, there's probably a very few of us who will do military work. You do have to, I think, put your medical ego away when you're working in the Army, because there will be people who know a lot more than you do about other things who will be directing you or asking you to do things which on one level you think are annoying or unnecessary, but on another level you need to fit in with the command and control system within defence. So yeah, an ability to put your own kind of needs to one side to meet a common goal probably goes across both disciplines, really.
Yeah, were there many things, I know you're casting your mind back a little bit here, traits of one that helped you with the other?
Look, I think persistence and failing and getting up and trying again. I think I don't consider myself to be academically the smartest person I've ever met, certainly in medicine. But I do think I've got an ability to take on a task and work towards it and achieve it. And you've got to have that ability in medicine, particularly at university, to get over those exams, and then in surgery to get over those exams, because they are probably the hardest exams anyone will ever sit in any discipline. And, that's something that I think was just ingrained in me from a young age.
Stay with me, Glenn. We'll be back in a moment. I'm talking to Dr Glen Farrow, author of the book Frontline Patient Safety. And you talk about going into administration, and so in a sense, your third career is actually as a business leader, effectively. Was that very different to the army and then practicing medicine?
It was different, but I was able to use skills from both the army and medicine and my clinical experience to help me in my director roles. So, having a solid, robust clinical qualification in surgery and having done a bit of clinical work goes a long way when you have to manage other specialists and junior doctors in hospitals. It just gives you that level of credibility that you don't have if you've, not really been clinically active. And I think the army, again, taught me a lot about how to deal with and communicate with different sorts of people. So, I would deal with clearly infantry officers, aviation, Navy, all sorts of people who had nothing to do with medicine, but with whom I could communicate well. And I think that particular skill and the ability to understand what clinicians face on the front line have held me in good stead. Administration has turned out to be a lot harder than I actually thought it would be. It's a very difficult job.
Why is that?
Well, essentially, problems come to you after everybody else has had a crack to solve them, and they get to you when they've become difficult and insoluble. And you learn pretty quickly how to negotiate and how to, I guess, steer your way through competing interests to get to a solution that all sides are at least satisfied with.
Then you became an author. Why?
I became an author because I felt the need to write my experiences down, particularly because in my last full-time role as a Director of Clinical Governance, which is quality and safety, and being responsible for looking at all the serious adverse events that happened in a couple of children's hospitals, it was clear to me that the same errors of judgment and the same factors were leading to poor patient outcomes now as they were when I was training as a medical student, an intern and junior doctor. And that was 30 years ago. And it just struck me that there was this continuous cycle of relearning and relearning, which was occurring at the cost of patient care. So initially I just kept notes on some of the adverse events that I was seeing in a little book on my computer called the Book of Adverse Outcomes. And after about 5 years, I looked at it and thought, I could make this into some kind of a manual for junior staff to try and teach them about the causes of adverse events. And about that time, I came into contact with a lady called Jackie Lane, who helps potential authors write books. And she was able to guide me through the process of writing the book Frontline Patient Safety. And it was at that stage that she pointed out to me the value of the lessons in this book beyond healthcare. And I guess that's, in a sense, what brings me to talk to you today.
Well, we'll get on to the book more specifically in a moment. What I just find interesting in what you said there was that the same mistakes were being made over 30 years. Is that a failure of governance or a failure of process that things didn't improve in that period?
Well, it's not a failure of governance. In fact, we now, because of the governance structures in place, we now know and we now have data, which we didn't have many years ago, as to what are the causes of adverse events. We now know more precisely. They're clearly communication errors, they're breaches of policy and protocol, and they're still poor clinical decisions. So that's the three big ones that we know, and data shows that. Now, what we have now is organisations in health with very good systems, but we still have people within those systems who don't use them. So, a system won't work if you don't use it, clearly. And what we see now is because some of the staff aren't adequately trained in how to practice safely, they will at times not use the systems or inadvertently ignore signs and symptoms, which they really should. So, the wealth of data we have now, the electronic systems we have to keep patients safe are really light years ahead of what was there 30 years ago. But the people within that system still are struggling to make those decisions. And that's where we get into the area of human factors and why it is that people in certain situations make the decisions that they do.
But that's presumably relevant in medicine, as an administrator, in the army. It kind of comes down to individuals and how they behave.
Well, it does. It's not blame culture. That was different. That was kind of looking for scapegoats. But this has moved on to a just culture and accountability, but also helping people understand what the factors are around them that will affect their decision making and what are the pitfalls. Because if we can get people within systems making better decisions, then we're going to get a better outcome for patients.
Okay, one of the chapters is called the collision drill. Tell us about that.
What I learnt in the army was there are certain situations where you need to act instinctively. Things people will just know about as, weapons drill and how to take apart and put a weapon back together and all those sorts of things, which we're all trained to do. And I thought about those particular drills in terms of, seeing a patient in the middle of the night, half asleep and then them deteriorating, and you need to know what to do without really thinking. So the collision I refer to is an incident where towards the end of my parachute course, we were doing a simultaneous door exit from a C-130 Hercules. So paratroopers going out both sides at the same time. And you can imagine the slipstream drags the paratroopers all back into one line initially, and there's potential for collision, and the canopies do in fact cross over. So that particular exit can be hazardous, and so we're taught what's called a collision drill. And you'd think, the natural instinct when you're about to collide with something is to curl yourself up in a ball and hopefully ride out the collision, but that's exactly the wrong thing to do. In fact, what we were taught to do is spread ourselves out like a starfish and not get entangled in the other canopy. So for me, I exited 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, looked up, canopy okay, high to the left, everything's clear, high to the right, and there was a guy heading straight at me, and I was heading straight for the risers of his parachute. So I immediately, without thinking, just shouted at him to, pull away, and then spread out like a starfish and just bounced clean off him.
Wow.
And I still remember that quite vividly. And, completed the jump, landed on the ground perfectly, of course. And one of the instructors ran over and said to me, "Sir, that was the best collision drill I've ever seen." I don't know exactly what I said, but it was probably something like, "Oh, golly gosh, I'm terribly glad that you're happy with it, but I hope that doesn't happen again." Or words to that effect.
Wow.
Well, the thing was that had I become entangled, one of the canopies is going to collapse and one of us is going to get injured. And secondly, there's a potential for one of us to actually be killed. So that's an example of a drill that you learn that you can do instinctively that, can save a life. And similarly in medicine, being able to respond to rapid deterioration is just like that. I use the example of responding to a cardiac arrest. Years ago, I'd done some trauma training, and then I was working as a doctor in a private hospital in Melbourne, but I was also on call for coronary care, and there was a cardiac arrest there. And I hadn't dealt with a cardiac arrest for many years, but as soon as I ran down there and got involved, the training kicked in, and I moved to the head of the bed, and airway, breathing, circulation, went through the whole drill. And to a trained doctor, that doesn't sound particularly complicated, but people do freeze in the middle of the night, and having that automatic instinctive action overcomes the freezing and allows you to respond in a timely way.
Incredible. Now, before you go, and you run a New York Marathon, I'm very jealous.
Well, I have run it twice, actually. You'd think I'd known better.
Yeah. Oh, that's an aspiration of mine, to run the New York Marathon.
Oh, right. Well, the first time I did it was I ran it for charity, actually. Where I was working offered entry tickets if you raised a certain amount of money for them. So again, like you, it was a bit of a goal of mine. So I trained hard for that and managed to survive, which was great. And then I went back a second time in 2019 and did it again.
Oh, fantastic.
And I mean, the whole event, everything that goes on around the event is fabulous. New York's really welcoming and people cheer you on. the actual race itself is quite hard work.
Well, it's long.
It's long.
27 miles or whatever. Glenn, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.
That was Dr Glen Farrow, dual qualified adult and paediatric general surgeon and a specialist service medical officer in the Australian Army. He's also written a book, Frontline Patient Safety, 20 Strategies to Keep You and Your Patients Safe.